everyone. Welcome back to another of the CERC webinars, a really hot one in view of the US election. I'm very pleased, and I want to thank already our speakers, Claudia Masferrer, Sarah Pierce, and Craig Damian Smith, who is from our team, for making the time. We on purpose selected to wait until the last minute before the election to have this conversation in a way, because it's so topical, and we're all wondering why what will happen on Tuesday or the days that will follow after Tuesday, but also because we want to actually, we want not the webinar and the discussion not to concentrate on the election result, although of course this is important, but rather from a scientific perspective, from a researcher's perspective, looking at what has happened in this last 4 years and where do we stand in the Americas in terms of the governance of migration and asylum. And particularly, we want to decenter a little bit the discourse, so we want to hear from the different points of view in North America, so from Mexico, the US, and Canada. And well, Sarah in this sense represents the US point of view. So we're delighted to balance this with Claudia, that will say what this looks like from a Mexican perspective, and Craig will reflect on the Canadian perspective. The way we have organized this webinar in order to make it as interactive as possible is that I have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask the three speakers, and they will have a chance to first answer briefly my questions, but also then a second chance to answer to each other, because the way we understand this, it's like, you know, how can I say, a dialogue between these different perspectives and how each expert assesses the situation. And then, of course, I'll be taking questions from the chat. So feel free to write your comments or questions to any of the speakers. Also, while the speak will be taking note, and Claire Ellis, who is hidden behind the CERC Migration box, is also keeping an eye along with myself in case I miss something. So thank you all for making it. And without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce again Claudia Masferrer, Associate Professor from the Colegio De México, Sarah Pierce, who is a Policy Analyst from MPI, and Craig Damian Smith, who is a Senior Associate with us at CERC Migration at Ryerson. So here are my questions. So the broad question is, how have the last 4 years of US immigration policy affected the relationship between the three countries, Canada, the US, and Mexico? So North America more broadly, where do we stand now? And more specifically to Claudia, what are the special pressures and implications for Mexico, taking into account that Mexico is a migration hub, so it's an origin country, but also a destination and a transit country more pronouncedly in the last decade. For Sarah is her expert reflection on what is happening with the governance of migration and asylum, both at the border, at the southern border, but also more broadly. And Craig, beyond the general question, also what are the implications for Canada and also for the Canada-US border and the US, the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement that, as we know, was recently challenged by Canadian courts, arguing that the US is not a safe country. So I'll start with you, Claudia, and great to have you on board. So you go first to give us your short answer to this question.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here for this dialogue today. I think, so here in Mexico, we have a very complicated position, right? I mean, I'm sure that if you're here, you know that we have pressures from the south and from the north. And I guess, I mean, it was really clear that the pressures put on Mexico from the United States were really tough, especially with the threat for putting tariffs. And I think that changed definitely the relationship between Mexico and the United States. And this was partially motivated by the fact that there was a large number of Central Americans arriving. And I mean, together in a new form of migrant caravans. But I want to say that I think personally that the pressures and the implications and the challenges that we have are not new at all. What is new, I think, is the relationship between Mexico and the United States, the power that our countries have to negotiate this migration scenario. And I think what is clear is that if we in Mexico do not think of a change of narrative within Mexico and some congruency in terms of what we are demanding to the United States and how we present ourselves as a country that could be more open for immigration, I think that then it will be very easy for us to kind of like in a very reactive way, as we have been doing so far, just follow and fall on the pressures that are imposed on us, right? So if you think about migration from Central America, this started in the 1990s, 1970s, 1980s, when you think about different countries. Migration flows motivated by war and coup d'etat and economic hardship, but this is not new. And so Mexico has been a country for transit migration for many, many decades. What is new now is that now it suddenly becomes a problem, right? But when you think even on the issue of unaccompanied minors, for example, this is not new either. I mean, 2014, we had the large number of arrivals and the so-called crisis. When you think about Mexico as being a country of refugee, this is also not new, but it is different because our refugee system is overwhelmed. That's true. We don't have budgets for taking into account and what all the arrivals. And what is definitely new is that we do not have integration policies for the large number of returnees and their families that have been arriving again since the 2000s, right? So the number of deportations that we're seeing is not they're not as high as the ones that we saw with Obama, for example. And this is not a new challenge, but I do think that what is new is that all of these pressures have been putting pressures inside Mexico, so that we definitely now need to think, how are we gonna manage migration, integrate migrants, and just change the narrative to be more open and diverse.
Thank you, Claudia. That's that's a very, very important, I think, perspective also to point out what is old and what is new, and that probably a new narrative is needed also in Mexico. Sarah, then we welcome your answers.
Sure. So the Trump administration obviously has placed immigration at the top of its to-do list. It's been extremely assertive, excuse me, on immigration during these 4 years. And it put those immigration priorities ahead of foreign policy and foreign relations, really, and engaged in a lot of strong arm tactics with many countries across the globe in an effort to forward their immigration agenda, but especially with our neighboring countries. So Claudia is completely right. There were not as many deportations going from the United States to Mexico during the Trump administration, and I can talk about why that is, but there were, in place of those, humanitarian migrants. So the Trump administration put into place the migration protection protocols, requiring more than 60,000 now asylum seekers to wait at the northern border of Mexico while their years-long asylum proceedings are happening in the United States. And since the pandemic started, the administration put in place an order that mandates the immediate expulsion of anyone trying to enter our southern border without authorization. Even if they come to a port of entry and apply for asylum, we're immediately expelling them. Many of them are being sent back to their home countries, but many more are instead being expelled back to Mexico. So over the course of the Trump administration, there's been this buildup of humanitarian migrants at Mexico's northern border, which certainly puts an immense amount of pressure on that relationship. And then, of course, there's nothing that placed more pressure on this relationship than the president's threat of tariffs on Mexico, which then were met with Mexico's agreement not only to step up enforcement, but also to accommodate that larger population of humanitarian migrants through the migrant protection protocols. So there's been an immense amount of pressure there. With Canada, there's been less of that direct back and forth, but certainly the president's policies have had a serious impact on Canada. I think maybe most notably, and Craig should correct me if I'm wrong on this, but TPS. So In the United States, we have a status called temporary protected status. It recognizes disasters happening in home countries and recognizes the reality that those individuals may not be able to return to their home countries, and in place offers them a temporary, in theory, status in the United States. However, in reality, administrations have extended this status on and on, so that for some nationalities, it's become rather permanent. The president said before he came office that he intended to end that, and he has or has attempted to end it for certain nationalities. And that has created a lot of pressure on Canada, because we've seen many of those populations then go to Canada and seek asylum in Canada, placing increasing pressure on that relationship. I think there, was a good amount of cooperation with the pandemic. The agreements with both Mexico and Canada to stop non-essential travel from coming over the border were quite interesting and I think unprecedented. But mostly we've seen a lot of strong arm tactics coming out of this administration, and a lot of aggression, with the main priority being their immigration agenda rather than any proper and healthy relationships.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, indeed. It is interesting to see also what happens in reality and what is the rhetoric and how the rhetoric has evolved in this administration. So Craig, what is your take from the Canadian perspective?
I'm worried that I'm going to talk significantly more than the other two colleagues, but I'll try to get through it quickly. The Trump policies have affected Canada in two clear ways, and one way which I think is somewhat less clear. So first, plans to cancel temporary protected status, yes, but also changes to the asylum system. The last in, first out change, new rules, and inland immigration enforcement, so ICE raids, significantly were a driver for people to move to Roxham Road at the New York-Quebec border and claim asylum in Canada. Slashing refugee resettlement quotas from over 100,000 in 2016, now down to 15,000 for 2021, pushed Canada to the position of the world's top resettlement country. And though the evidence is still weak about this, I think that it's likely that some skilled immigrants, entrepreneurs, and students have considered or will consider Canada over the US. But the Safe Third Country Agreement is obviously the biggest issue for Canada. And as a bit of background, the STCA was signed in the wake of September 11th as part of this broader border and security regime with the US, and it came into force in 2004. And it stipulates that both countries are safe places to claim asylum, and thus asylum seekers can be turned back if they show up at the border. But importantly, it only applies to official border crossings on the land border. So people can fly into Canada or the US, although the flow really only goes one way, and claim asylum or cross between regular ports of entry. So irregular entries, as we saw at Roxham Road. It's been challenged twice in federal courts. It was over those challenges. The federal court first struck down the Safe Third Country Agreement, but that was overturned on appeal. And then the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. And then again this summer, it was overturned. And last week, the government applied for a stay on that ruling. The appeal court granted them that stay. So as of now, the Safe Third Country Agreement is still in effect until the outcome of the final appeal in February or March. But that point's kind of moot because the COVID-19 related border closures mean asylum seekers can't cross the border anyways. The government's argument for the stay was that canceling the STCA, so declaring that the US is not a safe place for refugees, would lead to this unmanageable surge of asylum seekers coming over the border. So the argument wasn't about whether or not the US is safe, but that the outcome could be that more asylum seekers show up and that overwhelms the Canadian system. I think they missed kind of the point of the whole court decision, but that doesn't mean that political considerations and forecasting calculations are unwarranted if you're the government. I think that the big issue is that there's a political problem for what states do when their partners in migration governance renege on their commitments, which then effectively shift the burden to neighboring states. And this is something that we've seen, all throughout Europe for a decade at least. The arrival of almost 60,000 people at the border contributed to significant backlogs in Canada's refugee status determination system. There's now 90,000 cases pending, but also attempts at burden shifting between jurisdictions and levels of government in Canada. The Communist Party, the Conservative Party of Canada, and some upstart populists tried to leverage Roxham Road to push anti-immigrant and anti-globalist electoral agendas last year, but they failed. And for their part, the Trudeau government has talked about modernizing the agreement and explicitly avoided calling out the Trump administration, though we know that civil servants in Canada still have good working relationships with the Department of Homeland Security. And I can get into kind of like the forecasting stuff and the question and answer, but I think that it's clear from the research that I've done with refugee claimants who use Roxham Road and research from Australia and Europe that asylum seekers' mobility decisions are definitely influenced by differentials in reception conditions and the chance at protection. And they're definitely paying attention to what's happening in those differentials between the US and Canada. And this brings me to kind of my main point, and I think this is something that's completely overlooked by advocates in Canada and the US, that the Safe Third Country Agreement is predicated on burden sharing, which we now call responsibility sharing. And the preamble, which I'm going to quote briefly, and here I'm quoting, this is the preamble of the Safe Third Country Agreement, emphasizes that the US and Canada offer generous systems of refugee protection, recalling both countries' traditions of assistance to refugees and displaced persons abroad, consistent with principles of international solidarity that underpin the international refugee protection system, and committed to the notion that cooperation and burden sharing with respect to refugee status claimants can be enhanced. End of quote. So more broadly, so the STCA is all about responsibility sharing and burden sharing, which underpins the international refugee regime. We know for a fact that most refugees are hosted in poor countries, 85% of the world's 26 million refugees. Rich states have this choice between financial support, offering asylum, or resettling refugees. And the Trump administration has reneged on all these counts, which in turn has directly affected Canada, has affected Mexico, has affected Central America, and hundreds of thousands of refugees and would-be asylum seekers around the world. And so to use Trumpian terms, without this commitment to cooperation, solidarity, and responsibility sharing, fundamentally there is no deal. There's no Safe Third Country Agreement if we don't have a partner in the US. And that's leaving the whole rights of asylum seekers and whether or not their human rights are violated by Canada turning people back aside. And to me, that's the point that's entirely missed. And if we're talking about potential election outcomes, which I'll get to in the question and answer in the next questions, that's the big question, whether or not we have a malign, retributive actor in the White House in January or a partner that's going to rebuild the institutions and reputation of the US. And I think I'll end it there.
Thank you, Craig. Yeah, that was, so now we have a fuller picture. So I would like to give you the chance also to react to one another, and also particularly to what Claudia said, who actually said, yeah, maybe it's time for Mexico also to reconsider its position. And I have to say that I think how I watched Mexico grow in the global governance of migration, there's been significant steps taken in the last 15 years. So I don't know, maybe it doesn't translate directly to the relationship between Mexico and the US at the border, but I have seen, I think, Mexico, like Morocco, have grown into players in the global governance system. But I think what you all three of you are touching upon, and I would like also to invite you to reflect, is a difference between rhetorics and policies. For instance, you just said, Craig, that the Trudeau government has been particularly careful or reluctant to call out on the Trump administration. At the same time, we have watched the Trump administration, doing a lot of rhetorical politics and also sometimes forgetting about them. So calling about the construction of a wall. And I recently heard again at some speech of Trump to say the wall has been completed, and it had escaped my attention if it had, because I had followed in the beginning. And of course, no one speaks about the contractors that benefit from these things, but also reading that Trump, what you said, Sarah, that Trump has not been particularly active on deportations, but at the same time, he's closed effectively the border to asylum seekers. And that the other thing that you might want to briefly comment, Sarah, because I know you've done work on this, is how I think the Trump administration has been very vocal on the question of highly skilled temporary migrants. But at the same time, it has not acted into any kind of comprehensive reform, but rather on, again, this spasmodic policies, and how this creates, for all three of you to comment on how this creates, how this affects the whole region. If we can imagine North America as just one region, Mexico, US, and Canada, where does the region stand at this moment? Because the other thing I think that we have seen is before there was much more sense of a regional approach, and now Trump is the US against anyone. So it's kind of a more nationalist approach, at least in rhetorics. So I think I'll invite Claudia first again.
Great. Thank you for the comments and questions. And I mean, this gives you the opportunity to actually link what you're saying of the rhetorics with the idea of a limbo. And I think that if I want to characterize what we are living now in Mexico is really a limbo, because all these asylum seekers that were sent back to wait for their status in Mexico are really in a limbo. I mean, under MPP, it's even unclear where they are. Like, right, the Mexican authorities right now, they do not know where they are after COVID. At the same time, you see that the populations in the United States under TPS, but also under DACA, are under a great uncertainty. And this uncertainty, it's different for TPS holders and for DACA holders. But maybe, I mean, a lot of the discussion right now with the Biden and Trump, in the Biden and Trump debates, has been around DACA. And I mean, they really fear deportation at any point in time. They don't want to go back to Mexico because that's a place that they don't know. But less discussion has been put on their parents and just like other adults that are in the United States with a irregular status. And I think there's research that shows that all of these family members also live in a limbo with fear, insecurity, and they're vulnerable. You have 500,000 US-born minors in Mexico that are living in Mexico with at least one Mexican. Most of them are living with at least one Mexican parent, and nobody's talking about the implications of these children living in Mexico. And you need to think that they're coming from mixed status families, many of them who, I mean, decided to come back to Mexico, but they're also in a kind of a vulnerable place of uncertainty about not only where they belong, but also what will happen for them in the future. And I think when you think about the rhetorics and just the disconnect between the policy and the legislation, in the case of Mexico, it's interesting that we have a very open, I mean, our legislation is very good in paper, but it has not been implemented. Not only because all of the rulings and the procedures have not been accomplished on time, but also because there's no budget, right, for processing asylum claims or just granting status. And so we have an institutional framework, but that puts these populations in vulnerability, both in Mexico and the United States. And I think COVID has highlighted these vulnerabilities, right? for both Mexicans in the United States and Mexico. And I think that in the case of Canada, it's interesting that what Craig said in terms of, I mean, Canada is worried that there would be like an upsurge of numbers of asylum seekers if suddenly it is perceived as more open for protection. And I think the same thing is happening in Mexico. So the Mexican president, and I've heard all this also from US colleagues, they do think that if Mexico goes ahead and changes the discourse for being more open, as it did in the beginning of our administration with López Obrador, focusing on human rights and protection, that then all of these migrants from Central America, Venezuela, Colombia, Haiti, Cuba, they would be willing to go to the United States and just like use Mexico as a channel, right? And I think there's this idea that they wouldn't stay in Mexico, but we are seeing an increasing number of people who are staying, both refugees, immigrants, returnees, deportees from Central America that decide that instead of going to the United States back, which is very dangerous if they are detained, they decide to stay in Mexico. So I think the problem with all of this is that because in paper everything seems fine, I mean, from the Mexican perspective, fine, I mean, in quotes, right? Because we definitely have all the 400 actions that the Trump administration put in place. So, but I mean, the problem is that we still don't have ways for integrating these populations, for making sure that they are not vulnerable, making sure that they are not living in a position of insecurity or fear or in a limbo. So we do need to change their status for some certainties. And if they do not have MPP holders or other populations don't have some kind of security of what will happen or certainty of what will happen in the future, it's really hard for them to integrate here to Mexican society. And I think the idea of a limbo is very problematic, right? Not only for an irregular status, but also for what will happen due to COVID, or what will I lose my job, or what. It's just like a very uncertain times. I'll leave it there. I think I spoke
Thank you.
more than 5 minutes.
I think that has been I mean, uncertainty or unpredictability has been a feature of the current administration. Sarah.
Sure. So obviously there's a lot to react to, but maybe something that touches on both what Craig and Claudia have said is really the lost opportunity that happened during this administration to create a system that more properly shares burden across our countries. And you know, the irony that the Safe Third Country Agreement is based in burden sharing, and that the Trump administration enacted asylum cooperation agreements with the 3 Northern Triangle countries with this idea of burden sharing, but really at the same time rejected the burden that we should be taking on at the same time. And it's a shame. They are so willing to push migrants back to Mexico, but then unwilling to extend a helping hand to help build up Mexico and Central America's humanitarian infrastructure. And that's really been a shame. And I think that's something that I definitely fear in a second Trump administration, that there would be more pressure placed on asylum systems that are just not ready to handle these flows. I mean, the US asylum system is insufficient, and the idea that we would push migrants to other countries without offering any sort of technical assistance or financial assistance is really unconscionable.
Thank you, Sarah. So Craig?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on this kind of intersection between institutions and rhetoric. I mean, so this is what we're not doing today, but imagine Biden wins the election next week. You've had 4 years of dismantling an asylum and resettlement system in the US. So Biden's immigration platform is obviously vastly different than Trump's. And in last Thursday's final presidential debate, the first time that immigration really was there in one of the presidential or vice presidential debates, Biden distanced himself from these Obama-era record-level deportations and border enforcement policies. And he promised to reform the asylum system, stop the ICE raids, and to put forward legislation to regularize 11 million undocumented people, fix TPS, fix DACA, et cetera. Those are important rhetorical moves that could help change people's perceptions of whether or not the U.S. is a desirable place to go. And it could, that goodwill is something that Canada and Mexico can both, capitalize on and help support. But it's not going to change the fact that U.S. immigration judges have resigned or retired early in record numbers in the U.S. during the Trump administration. It's not going to bring back dozens of local settlement offices that were forced to close. It's not going to reverse the massive losses at the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service to vet and resettle refugees. And so even in the short term, matching the institutional capacity with the rhetoric is something that Mexico and Canada, should be able to support and realize that things aren't going to change overnight, and that there's very real and long-lasting institutional repercussions of 4 years of missed opportunities.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Craig. Yeah, that's a good point. That also, of course, the rhetorics have translated into specific cuts in services. Actually, I think another thing that we're seeing in these last 4 years is that the whole discussion, not only there has been no regional system for sharing responsibility for people seeking international protection, but also this, the whole thing has been conceived as a zero-sum game. So I win, you lose. And also, I think that was the first time, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in the region, the migration policy was so other policies were used to, how can I say, force the neighboring countries into cooperation in a policy that was not agreeable to them, like using always basically tariffs and trade. Also, these were used against Canada to impose your view. So correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a new feature. And I think what we are, well, I believe we can be fairly sure, is that if the administration changes, this won't happen. But the question, of course, is also what would be the next steps in the views of the three of you? What would be the next steps necessary to start putting at least the foundations of, regional cooperation and a regional system for, governing asylum? Claudia?
Yeah, I want to go back on the region issue. So 4 years ago, just before we knew that President Trump was going to be elected, some colleagues of Colmex were invited to to do a study on demographic dynamics, immigration policy, and trying to understand if there was a mismatch between the policies in North America, Canada, United States, and Mexico in relation to the migration system of North America and Central America. And I have to say that in these 4 years, there has been a lot of discussion about the region, right? And we had the USMCA NAFTA negotiation and discussions, and I think this is framed within these discussions of North America. But what was always interesting for me from Canada, from being in Canada in Montreal for almost 8 years, was that we would always have a very difficult time highlighting North America as 3 countries, right? So in the minds of many Canadians and Americans, the position of Mexico is very weird, right? So some people think Mexico is not in North America. Some people think that Central America is some weird region in like south of the United States. They don't know whether it goes until Panama or the Northern Triangle of Central America being Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Some people think about it, but some people don't. So back then we were talking about the neighborhood, meaning those 6 countries, Mexico, Canada, United States, but then also Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And when you think about it as a region, I think counting the 6 countries, there has been a long history of exchange between these countries. But somehow, and for many, natural reasons, geopolitical reasons, the relationship between Canada and the United States has always been one. And Canada has one bilateral relation with the United States, have like another set of bilateral relations with Mexico and with other countries in Central America. The Salvadoran population in Canada is larger than the population in other places. It's quite big, but somehow I think when we think about the title of the session being the balanced power in North America, I think it's interesting first of all just to think what's North America. And I think in these 4 years after Trump administration, and like after I've been talking about the migration system of North America and Central America, I think it's clear that if the region does not accept itself as a region, then it will be hard, right? And so, more recently, MPI Colmex prepared a report talking about regional cooperation, and we discussed the fact that I think all of these issues cannot be solved if we do not start having conversations between the 6 countries, and it's always hard. It is hard to have conversations among 2 countries, among 3 countries, and 6 is even harder. But I do think that we need to think about the regional perspective where Canada, Mexico, the United States think about ways for cooperation. The truth is that now, we don't see that Central America migration will stop suddenly if the conditions in these countries do not change. When you look at Mexican migration, you see a large number of migrants coming to the United States, for example, under H2, H2A visas for agriculture and non-agricultural work. You have a lot of exchange. You have now a larger population that is actually with the documented status. In Canada, you have the seasonal workers program that is very important for agriculture. So I think there are ways that we can think about these legal talk among each other and just like try to debate how can we find solutions for cooperation, right? And this needs to happen, otherwise we'll just keep having bilateral discussions and a regional problem.
Yeah, that is a good point, and I think you highlight very well also that a lot is happening on the ground. So I think the question is, do the 3 countries will they have the courage to acknowledge and tackle things proactively rather than just patch or use zero-sum dilemmas? Sarah.
So I couldn't agree more with Claudia that we need to come together as 6 countries, not only as 3. We need to include the Northern Triangle since they are the biggest source of humanitarian migrants right now. I think, in an ideal world, moving forward to create some sort of regional humanitarian system, we would obviously first need to restore the humanitarian systems in the United States. We would need to, work with Mexico to build up their humanitarian system as well. And then we need to work on the journey. Ideally, we don't want migrants engaging in this really long and dangerous journey to come to Mexico, to come to the United States, to come to Mexico. So having remote processing and robust remote processing. We've had remote processing before that the United States has run, and it was slow, and it's just, absurd to think that anyone fleeing persecution would be able to wait out that process. But having something available in the home countries, not to say that we wouldn't still have asylum at our borders, that needs to be there, but having some sort of remote processing so migrants aren't forced to engage in these really long journeys. At the very least, that would be a starting point.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Although, if I may come into this from an EU perspective, I don't think extraterritorial processing can work. For even the first reason is capacity. Who's going to do it with what capacity? Because there is something, difficult though it is to admit this, that those people who can make the journey are maybe the more resourceful or the more desperate. But I think it has been, there has been a lot of discussions in the EU in relation to asylum seeking both from, Asia and Africa. And I haven't seen yet the silver bullet, so
Yeah, I'm definitely not proposing it as the silver bullet or even the one policy moving forward, right? We absolutely need asylum at our borders. That even if we had this amazing, robust remote processing system, migrants would still be fleeing. Persecution on the ground would still need protection at our borders. So that still needs to be there. But having a way for migrants to avoid engaging in that long journey, especially considering how difficult it is to get asylum under the actual definition of asylum, having that opportunity to apply at home or at least close to home, I think is an important piece of a larger puzzle.
Yeah, an important step forward. Craig, your reaction, and may I also, I think, take related questions from the chat that are probably addressed to all three of you, or particularly to Craig and Sarah. So do we think that you seem to be suggesting, Craig, before, that even if Biden is elected, it won't be possible to reverse, or at least not immediately for sure, to reverse the course of things? So is that right, that there won't be much of a difference, or it is so difficult to reverse the course of the action? And I think there is a question also on how the US is seeing the future of the agreement with Canada. Okay.
Yeah. Just in terms of the regionalism thing, so, Canada is the world's top resettlement country now, and our global brand is built on that reputation around resettlement increasingly. If you look at, and I'll have a working paper on our CERC website next week about Canada's relationship with the Western Hemisphere and migration and asylum governance. Fewer than 1% of the refugees who are resettled to Canada per year come from the Western Hemisphere, despite the fact that the displacement crises in the Western Hemisphere equal the scale of the Syrian displacement crisis. That's something worth noting. Canada also put its name forward to be basically the interim presidency, or the interim chair of the Global Compact on Refugees implementation, called MIRPS, for looking at displacement from Central America. So we want to help lead these regional responses, yet at the same time, Canada seems to ignore the prospect of resettlement from the region. That's something that Canada could immediately do the day after the election, the day after the inauguration, start thinking about that with the US as a partner. That's resettlement and regionalism. The other question is humanitarian protection and the asylum system in the US. And I think that maybe, Sarah can speak to this more readily than I can, but scaling up that capacity, that's something that's going to require a significant expenditure and political will. And I don't know if that's going to be there immediately. Canada also has these twinning projects or capacity building projects with COMAR, with the Mexican Asylum Agency, where decision makers from Canada's Refugee Status Determination Tribunal, the Immigration and Refugee Board, go and train would-be decision makers and translate countries, etc., in Mexico. But it's a minuscule program, right? We had like $180,000 in the budget. Scale up an asylum system with that level of support, but the beginnings of the building blocks of more regionally oriented asylum and humanitarian protection systems are there, and that's, I think, one positive lesson that we can bring out of this. But the question about in the chat, whether or not Biden administration immediately means that the Safe Third Country Agreement can just stay there. I mean, I think it's a very difficult question, keeping in mind that Canada still also has electoral politics, and maybe our resilience to anti-immigrant populism. I don't think that that's infinite. So those are also things to think about.
Thank you, Craig. I think we have one more outstanding question. So what do on one hand for Sarah, what does the US think about the US-Canada Safe Third Country Agreement? And a question to all three, what do you think about humanitarian visas? So maybe Sarah, about the US-Canada agreement.
Sure. I mean, I think it's ironic that the Trump administration has been quite quiet on the Canada Safe Third Country Agreement, considering how readily they push Safe Third Country agreements below our to the south of our border. And that, I mean, more widely, I think, you know, obviously Canada is really respected on a global scale and in the United States as a safe country for humanitarian migrants. So I think generally the population views it quite popularly, and the Biden administration, I assume, would as well. But it's hard to judge since I haven't heard a lot. It's surprising. I think it's a testament to the litany of changes we've experienced in the United States on immigration in the last 4 years that there has not been a lot of discussion on the Canada Safe Third Country Agreement. I think there's just, unfortunately, so much else going on. And if I can speak to a little bit, if there is a Biden administration, what would be the changes? I really agree with Craig that it will be very difficult. It would be very slow change as well. So the Trump administration had immigration as its top policy priority. In a Biden administration, I don't even think immigration would be in the top 5 policy priorities. So there's a lot of emphasis on the idea that a Biden administration would unwind everything that occurred under Trump. And I think maybe that's true, but it would occur at a much slower pace than I think people expect. Also, during the Trump administration, they've been very creative in their use of bureaucratic tools. So they have used every bureaucratic tool available. And Claudia made reference to a report we published this summer that documented all 400 of the changes that they made. And a lot of these changes are going to be more difficult to undo. On asylum, in particular, they have some pending regulations where if they go through with them, it might take a good amount of time for a Biden administration to undo them. So making our asylum system more welcoming could actually be a trickier and slower process, especially if a Biden administration is worried about a surge at the southern border of the United States. We just don't. Our infrastructure at the southern border has always been so focused on enforcement first that we don't have the capacity to handle humanitarian migrants, which is something we saw under the Trump administration and something Biden definitely wouldn't want to be seen as when he is president. So we need a lot of work. We need a lot of resources at the southern border, and then a lot of focus on how exactly you unwind all of these bureaucratic tools that have been, and changes that have been put into place.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, indeed, the US-Canada Safe Third Country Agreement has been shining by its absence from the discussions. But Craig, I think there is an invitation from the chat to elaborate a little bit more on why Canada is so absent from the region. And indeed, it occurs to me that while, I mean, there's been so much sensibility and sensitivity with regard to the Syrian crisis, why not about the Central American or the Venezuelan, particularly, crisis? And I think that would be a question also for why doesn't Mexico try to work more with Canada? So Craig and Claudia.
I just, part of it is clearly like messaging and journalistic focus. Why is it the case that like a dead child and father in the Rio Grande aren't the same emotional pull for Canadians to push to do more as a child's lifeless body on a beach in Turkey? It's how to answer those are difficult, but I think part of it is the civil society mobilization and existing politicization and activism diasporic networks in Canada. That's a big part of it. And there are groups in Canada from, whose parents are from Latin America who are trying to push for more resettlement. But very oddly, there has been basically a nil response from the Trudeau government. I think that a big part of that too is like Canada is wisely keeping its head down and has kept its head down during the Trump administration around this. And part of that includes not interfering in, to use like slightly problematic terms, but America's backyard or sphere of influence, which has typically been America's sphere of influence for not just for trade and not just for politics, but around migration management issues. And there's significant room to work around the margins for Canada and Mexico. The question is whether or not we have to do that, in the face of this, declining hegemon that in domestic political upheavals over the next 4 years, or one where we have a partner where we don't have to kind of sneak around and think about resettlement or even humanitarian visas from the region, that we can do it out in the open using all of Canada's political capital and very significant settlement and resettlement capacity.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. Although, that was a good question that I think you posed. That why did Alan Kurdi's picture raise such a solidarity feeling, and why not? I remember that was at least 3 years ago when a 13-year-old had been shot just south of the border because he was kind of a little bit provoking border guards, playing a game with other teens on the Mexican side of the border, and he was shot by a border guard. Why didn't that picture raise sensitivity for the public opinion? And also whether Claudia thinks, why doesn't Mexico engage more with Canada?
Yes, so let me answer first, Craig. I think there is somehow a psychological fear for something that is close. So Mexico is way more open for giving protection status to Venezuelans than people from Honduras or El Salvador, even if violence in El Salvador and Honduras is very high, right? I think as Canadians would be more open to protect Syrians who somehow seem further away than Mexicans or and I arrived to Canada in 2009, just after the visa was imposed. And I think that the visa imposition, even if it was lifted in 2016, had an impact in Mexico-Canada relations that we cannot forget. And I remember in that time, I was pushing more to increase Mexico-Canada relations. And I think that it was really clear that you need diplomacy, and you need Mexico to consider Canada also a important counterpart for discussion. But I like also Craig's point in terms of the activist group, and I think it needs to come both from the top and from below, right? So I do think that we need Mexican diplomats to be more to be better with Canada, right? And I think but at the same time, you also need these diasporas to be more active. And I always bring the example of, in 1986, Canada opened the door to Salvadorans who were about to be deported that could not regularize through IRCA. And so in Canadian consulates, they were granted permanent residency in Canada. And why cannot this happen today, right? Is it because we somehow consider ourselves a region that somehow we're closer to some extent to El Salvador, to Honduras, and somehow we fear more the idea of more arrivals because it seems somehow like a easier way for arriving? I don't know, but I do think that there is somehow this very weird psychological idea of not helping those in need very close to us. And just very quickly in terms of the visa was imposed in 2009 to Mexico, and when you see the number of homicides and violence in Mexico, it kicked off after 2006 when President Calderon declared the war on drugs. So it was actually the period where Mexico had no option for asking for protection for refugee status in Canada when homicide rates were the highest. It has still increasing. And we do have an issue here in Mexico internally to try to understand what will happen with internal displacement. The US is very bad granting status for protection for Mexicans, but it's another issue that we have right now, and we are also discussing what will happen with our internal law, with our law of internal displacement. But I think that a problem of this is that, I mean, if we think that there is this fear of protecting those who are in need very close to us, then I think it will be also very hard for Canada or the US to actually consider refugee claimants from Mexico, just as they are bad as considering that Salvadorians or Hondurans fleeing from violence and insecurity do need protection, right? So I think it would be easier for resettled refugees from these countries rather than from Syria. But if Mexicans in Canada, Mexicans in the United States, Mexicans in Mexico don't organize to actually change this, and that's why I think the narrative is important, then, I mean, it will be very, very hard. But we definitely need diplomacy, and we need grassroots organizations to mobilize these populations.
No, I think there is an answer to the geographical proximity or distance question, is that you feel you're in control if the place is far away. And similarly, although I don't think there's any comparison between the Canadian and the Australian asylum policy, Australians do not resettle anyone from Indonesia or Southeast Asia, but they do resettle from Africa because you feel you're more in control. But and I suppose, Craig, there is something there about the electoral politics in Canada, because after this flow of asylum seekers from the US, which still, I mean, again, by European standards was not very significant. I think there was a consideration there that it's better to keep quiet, keep a low profile, don't mess with the region, don't mess with the US backyard, don't open, you know, don't, how can I say, indirectly invite the flow, and keep a very evil US being the buffer in between. Of course, a question that has come also from the chat, but we're all, if someone wants to react to this briefly before we close, and I think it's a very interesting question. You may have seen that the EU is actively using what is called migration partnerships with important transit and origin countries in its so-called neighborhood. So in North Africa, but also in the Sahel and further down, particularly in Africa, where, you know, there's some, how can I say, the cooperation of the country is asked in terms of both immigration and transit migration management. And in return, there are promises for development aid, building capacity for border you know, security, and also legal migration. So why is it that Canada or the US are not using these? Or why is it that Mexico is not using these for countries which are important transit and origin countries? Maybe 1 minute to each. I'll start with Craig as a reaction to this.
The question of why not, I just think that the EU structure and the way that EU foreign policy is derived from home affairs concerns and the relationship between the European Commission and interior ministries in Europe, and how they interact with transit and sending countries it's just a different situation than between Canada, the US, and then Central and South America. It's also a fact of the scale of mixed migration. The political incentives aren't there as much, but, you know, from a political perspective, you could say that the regional response and host state support in Central America or for migrants from countries could be considered a form of externalization, but that's you're a critical scholar and I'm not. So That's my answer.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. No, I mean, and we cannot be in the government's minds, Sarah.
Sure. So I'm sure it's fairly obvious why that policy hasn't been considered in the United States for the last 4 years. The Trump administration has taken a very entitled approach to asylum and burden sharing, you know, essentially saying that we're full, we've done enough, it's your turn, you all can take these flows, whether or not you're prepared to. So I'd like, you know, my hope, if there is a Biden administration, is to see them focus less on unwinding everything that happened under Trump, because as we discussed earlier, that's just not possible. And my hope is that instead they would focus more on rethinking U.S. immigration system and thinking about creative solutions such as that, and you know, and other types of regional systems that we could develop. So hopefully we'll see something. Hopefully we won't have to answer why not in the future. Hopefully there will be work on that in the future. But under the Trump administration, their approach to humanitarian systems has just been so closed off and so entitled, and just assuming that humanitarian flows are illegitimate flows. You know, nothing, I could never fathom them working on something like that.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. And Claudia?
Yes, I think we need to be more proactive and less reactive, and we need to think ourselves. I mean, I tend to be very pessimistic, but I also think that we can try to be optimistic and try to think, where are there areas for opportunity for redirecting the pressures that we have from the United States, or just like focusing on other issues. I think that we do not know how the current administration would dialogue with a democratic administration, because in a way our president was very invested in trying to maintain a relation with Trump. So I think there could be room for opportunity for trying to negotiate things differently. But I think that if we do not think as a country, as a society, how are we going to deal with these issues in a very open way and trying to be consistent, then it will be easier for us to suffer from the pressures from abroad, right? So I think we do need to think internally how to find solutions and then try to propose them abroad. And I think that we have been very reactive, and we could change, but it has been really hard. So I hope, I mean, that my optimistic side stays in a couple of months. I do think that, I mean, having someone else besides Trump in the US presidency, if fear and insecurity is diminished, then maybe the society can also try to think more creatively, right? And the same thing would happen in Mexico. But I think that right now there is a lot of uncertainty, fear, insecurity, and just like mistrust about others and about institutions. And I think the same thing is happening in Mexico right now. We do have kind of like these uncertainties are just like not very positive, and COVID brings another uncertainty, but just like maybe there is room for hope, I would say, if we have Biden, even if the legislation will be hard to unbind.
Thank you, Claudia. Yeah, I think it's good to conclude with this positive note, and there's room for hope. And I think we do have a clear message to give to the three governments, so that they should work towards a regional approach, and that it should be more creative and more proactive, and particularly maybe for the new US administration, as you said, Sarah, instead of trying to undo what this administration has done, rather try to think more creatively and proactively. So thank you all for being with us today. A great big thanks to the speakers, and perhaps in a year's time we'll have to reconvene and see what happened. Thank you very much all. Have a great afternoon.